Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Island Uplift's history class. It is so good to have you here today. Now, in today's lesson, we will be taking a look at Hernan Cortes and the Aztecs. And this is a continuation from episode 10 of where we would have taken a general look at the Aztec civilization. In today's lesson, we're going to look at the man Cortes and his interactions and his impact on the people who belong to the Aztec civilization. So let's get into it. Now, the year is 1502, and Nicolas de Ovando has been sent by the man Juan de Fonseca to the island of Hispaniola. Fonseca was the man who orchestrated the arrest of Christopher Columbus. Now, Nicolas de Ovando, he was a military commander who fought in the war against the Moors in Granada, Spain, which ended in 1492, which is the same year that Columbus set sail on his first voyage. And in 1502, Ovando sailed for Hispaniola with 30 ships and 2,500 settlers. Now, there was supposed to be a certain man who was to join him on this initial voyage in 1502. The man was, in fact, his distant cousin. However, this man wasn't able to join Ovando until 2 years later in the year 1502. The man's name was Hernan Cortes. Now, about Hernan Cortes. He was born in the year 1485 in the town of Medellin, Spain. He was the son of Martin Cortes de Monroy, an infantry captain, and his mother was Catalina Pizarro Altamirano. At age 14, he was sent to attend a university in Salamanca, where he would learn Latin under the guidance of his uncle. He was then frequently described as being ruthless, haughty, and even mischievous. After that, he became a notary public official, acquiring immense legal knowledge based on Castile law. However, in all that he did, he felt trapped by the limits of his small town. And then he became interested in exploration upon hearing about the voyages and encounters of Christopher Columbus in the New World. Now, in the year 1502, Cortes was expected to join Nicolas de Ovando on his trip to colonize Hispaniola. However, Cortes was known as being a man who was given into many women. He picked up an injury while running from the bedroom of a married woman. Oh, Lord. Come on, Cortes. Come on. Anyway, he ended up leaving Spain in the year 1504 on a ship captained by Commander Alonso Quintero. The ship was sailing to Hispaniola to join the colonization efforts which were being started by Ovando on Hispaniola. Now, Quintero tried to deceive his superiors by reaching Hispaniola before they did in order to acquire lands for himself. So in the year 1504, Hernan Cortes arrives in Santo Domingo, Hispaniola, and upon arriving in Santo Domingo, Cortes registered to become a citizen of the colony when he was just 18 years old. Now, becoming a citizen allowed him to obtain a building lot and land for farming, and Governor Ovando even granted to Cortes an encomienda. He was also appointed as notary of the town of Azua de Compostela, which was established in 1504 and was located about 100 miles west of Santo Domingo. Cortes took active part in the continual conquest efforts in Hispaniola between the years 1506 and 1511. And then in the year 1511, Cortes joined Diego Velázquez when he was sent to Cuba in the conquest efforts of that island. Cortes then stayed in Cuba from 1511 to the year 1519, establishing settlements and attaining immense military and political ranks in the newly established colony. He even became municipal magistrate, which was also called an alcalde or a mayor of the city or the town of Santiago. And Santiago was at that time Cuba's capital city. He was especially and initially admired by Governor Velázquez. Now, in the year 1517, Governor Velázquez sent a conquistador named Francisco Hernandez de Cordoba to explore the Yucatan Peninsula, which is southern Mexico, and hopefully to establish a colony there. Upon arriving at the shore of the Yucatan, the Spaniards got a glimpse of some of the Mayan pyramids. As a result, they named the area El Gran Cairo, or the Great Cairo, after the pyramids of Egypt. Now, Cordoba and his men then became engaged in a series of conflicts with the Mayans, who defeated the Spanish overwhelmingly. Cordoba even died from wounds sustained during such conflicts. Then in the year 1518, Governor Velasquez sent another conquistador named Juan de Grijalva to continue the exploration and hopefully the settlement efforts, or really to start the settlement efforts. And here you see a map of Grijalva's journey from Cuba in touring the Yucatan Peninsula, and he went as far as the Rio Panuco. All right. As a matter of fact, a river was named after him in Mexico, as you can see there on the map, the Rio Grijalva. After Grijalva's return in late 1518, Governor Velasquez placed Cortes in charge of another expedition to the region. This time, unlike Cordoba or Grijalva, Cortes' assignment was to discover, conquer, and settle not the coast, but the interior of the Yucatan Peninsula. Little did they know that the interior was occupied by an advanced people, an empire, in fact, the Aztec Empire. Now, due to personal disagreements between them, Velasquez decided at the last minute to revoke Cortes' trip. Cortes ignored this order. So Cortes, in defiance of the order and practically in committing open mutiny, he left Santiago in February of 1519. He stopped off in the town of Trinidad in Cuba to hire more soldiers and to obtain more horses. So Cortes is journeying from Cuba into the territory known as the Yucatan territory, into the territory of the Mayans, and eventually into the territory of the Aztecs. So upon arriving on the island of Cozumel, Cortes and his men heard about white Spanish men who were there before them. That's interesting. And who were still living in the area. This is where he met Geronimo de Aguilar and Gonzalo Guerrero. Aguilar, in particular, was a Spanish Franciscan priest who had survived a shipwreck in the year 1511. He was also taken captive by the Mayans, but he escaped. Aguilar knew how to speak the Chontal Maya language, therefore becoming a translator for Cortes and his men. Now, both Aguilar and Guerrero were survivors of that Spanish shipwreck that occurred in the year 1511, that like what I was highlighting there. Cortes and his men won several victories along the coast while fighting against small coastal tribes. They ventured into the Tabasco region, where after winning a battle there, they captured 20 indigenous women and converted them to Christianity. Now, one of these women was named Lama Lynch, or her name was also called Marina. She knew both the Nahuatl language, the Nahuatl Aztec language, as well as the Chontal Maya language. As a result, Cortes was able to communicate with the Aztecs through the collaborative efforts of Aguilar and Malinche. Malinche was also, I remember Cortes was a man given into many women. Malinche was also Cortes's mistress and the mother of his first son, Martin. So here now we're going to look at Cortes's route as he ventures deeper into Aztec territory before finally reaching the Aztec capital. Now, in July of 1519, Hernan Cortes founded the settlement of Veracruz. In doing this, Cortes usurped the authority of Governor Velasquez in Cuba to fall directly under the directive of now Spanish monarch King Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor King Charles V. Now, Cortes was passionate about his quest to press onwards, even giving an order to scut all his ships to prevent his men from surrendering and retreating back to Cuba. Now, scutting was a deliberate action of sinking your ships to prevent any idea of retreating and so on, especially if you have a certain mission or certain task that you want to achieve. So that's how extreme things got. Now, if Cortes himself had returned to Cuba, he would have been imprisoned or sentenced to death for disobeying orders given by Governor Velasquez. His hope was to redeem himself by claiming, conquering, and colonizing the lands of the Spanish crown. Now, Cortes then established the tongue of La Villa Rica de la Veracruz, or Villa-Rica for short. He helped establish a tongue council for Villa-Rica, and in turn, that tongue council offered him the post of Captain General. He was even elected to the post of Chief Administrative Officer. Such a move allowed him to legally be removed from the authority of Velasquez and directly accountable to the Spanish crown. Now, La Villa-Rica de la Veracruz, or Villa-Rica, was built by a collaborative effort between the Spanish and the local Totonac people. The town became Cortes's first central place for planning and launching his attack on the Aztecs. Villa-Rica later on developed into the tongue that is known today as simply Veracruz, meaning the true cross. Now, while in Veracruz, Cortes met different settlements and officials of the Aztec Empire. His aim was to convince them to help him meet with this man that he heard about. He wanted to meet with the king or the emperor of the Aztecs, the empire's Quetzalcoatl, or the Aztec term for the great king, King Moctezuma II. And sometimes Moctezuma in certain sources would also be called Montezuma, all right, but it's the same person. Now, King Moctezuma heard about the request and denied it several times, but Cortes was determined, leaving 100 men in Veracruz and commencing a march with 600 men, 15 horses, 15 cannons, and hundreds of indigenous carriers and warriors. The destination of the march? Tenochtitlan, the capital city of the Aztec Empire. Now, while traveling to Tenochtitlan, Cortes met and made alliances with many indigenous people. Now, most notably, he met the Sempoala and the Tlaxcaltec tribes. Cortes even began releasing prisoners from battles that he won along the way. This was one of many strategies that convinced many other kings and princes in the region to ally with the Spanish. Cortes arrives on his journey at the town of Tlaxcala. Now, Tlaxcala was a confederacy of about 200 towns. Tlaxcala was not under Aztec rulership or influence. Now, there was a great deal of hatred between Tlaxcala and the Aztecs because of wars fought in the past and because of a commercial blockade imposed on Tlaxcala by the Aztecs. This left the city and the Confederacy in general in immense poverty. Now, the Tlaxcaltecs greeted the Spanish initially with hostility. However, the Tlaxcalan leaders decided that it would be best to join with the Spanish in their cause against the Aztecs. Cortes and his men stayed in Tlaxcala, where the Tlaxcaltecs offered them food, and I guess Cortes would have loved this one, and women. Some of the Tlaxcaltec leaders trusted Cortes and even became baptized Roman Catholics. So Cortes now eventually received reinforcements in the sum of about 1,000 Tlaxcaltec warriors. And then they began their journey into the next settlement area, which is the area known as Cholula. Now, Cholula was a religious and sacred city of the Aztecs. Some of the empire's largest and holiest sites and temples were actually located there. Cortes was encouraged by some to go to Cholula, but the Tlaxcaltecs urged him not to go there as it was an Aztec city. Cortes decided to compromise and go to Cholula while receiving the military help of Tlaxcala, which was about 3,000 Tlaxcaltec warriors. Now, it is alleged that a rumor was communicated to Cortes by his mistress, Lama Lynch, that the people of Cholula were waiting to kill him and his men by night in their sleep. And this started something serious. In retaliation, Cortes initiated a massacre that killed thousands. Some estimate that as many as 30,000 people were killed in that massacre. And he ensured not just the commoners, but he also killed the nobility, and he also burned most of the city. Now, this massacre in Cholula, it sent a chilling effect and message throughout all Mesoamerica. Cortes even sent 2 ambassadors to Tenochtitlan to warn King Moctezuma that they would meet the same fate as Cholula unless the Spanish are respected, gifted with gold, and unless they see that all their other demands are met, my lord. So Cortes later claimed that he conducted the massacre and the burning of Cholula for 2 main reasons. He claimed that 1, it was to send a message to the Aztecs waiting for him in Tenochtitlan, and 2, it was to quench any treacherous desire among the indigenous people who marched with him or who he just overcame to fight against him. And it did send a message. And of course, this now prepared them to march into the city of Tenochtitlan. So let's look at Cortes's entrance into Tenochtitlan. Now, Cortes and his men took 3 months to reach the outskirts of Tenochtitlan, which is modern-day Mexico City. Now, Tenochtitlan was a huge city, one of the biggest and grandest in the world, with an estimated population at the time of between 60 and 300,000 inhabitants. Wow. King Moctezuma greeted Cortes with flowers from his personal garden, which was a high honor bestowed upon visitors by the Aztecs. Now, it is assumed, though, that because of the sacred nature of Moctezuma's post and because Cortes and his men were outsiders, that the Aztec king probably did not meet face-to-face initially with Cortes. So that's an interesting point to note. Now, Moctezuma had the palace of his father, King Aztec, prepared to house the Spanish and the Tlaxcaltec allies. Now, Cortes demanded more gold from the Aztecs. He also demanded that 2 large idols be removed from the city's main temple, as well as the blood from human sacrifices be scrubbed off. And he ordered that shrines of St. Mary and St. Christopher be built in place of the 2 demolished idols. The Aztecs met all those demands. Cortes then made Moctezuma a prisoner in his own palace. He placed the man under house arrest. This was done to prevent any Aztec revolts, as well as to act as leverage for him for asking for more gold. Now, the city of Tenochtitlan then began feeling pressured, seeing that their king was now a captive and that they had to provide for the needs and demands of not just the Spanish, but their neighborhood enemies, Tlaxcala. Now, I want to interject here and address something, a legend that developed over time, and it's called Cortes being Quetzalcoatl. And remember, we would have mentioned Quetzalcoatl in episode 10, where we looked at the Aztecs. Now, it has been and still is debated as to whether this was true or not. Nevertheless, here is the story. So Cortes apparently wrote to King Charles V, explaining to him that the Aztecs took him either for an Aztec deity or an emissary of that deity. That deity's name was Quetzalcoatl. Now, Quetzalcoatl, whose name comes from the Nahuatl Aztec language, meaning precious serpent or Quetzal feathered serpent, was a being that took on the form of a feathered serpent, as the name suggests. He was seen as the Aztec god king of the sun, wind, rain, learning, and he also controlled lightning. He did many things. And he was also the creator of all human beings. Now, there was an ancient prophecy that Quetzalcoatl would one day return to Earth, the earth on which he created human beings. His return would be to accomplish two main things. One, to end the need to continue conducting human sacrifices to appease the sun god Huitzilopochtli, and two, to recapture Tenochtitlan as his own. Now, the prophecy stated that Quetzalcoatl would return in a year known as a one-reed year to reclaim Tenochtitlan. Now, the pre-Columbian calendar that the Aztecs followed was divided into 52-year periods or cycles, and we would have explained this in episode 10. Every 52nd year was called a Seacatl, or a one-reed year. It just so happens that the year 1519, the year that Cortes arrived in Tenochtitlan, was a one-reed year. This might have caused King Moctezuma to assume that Cortes may have been Quetzalcoatl, thus explaining why he greeted Cortes with such honor and pomp. So Hernan Cortes had now taken over the city of Tenochtitlan. However, while in Tenochtitlan, Cortes learned of an approaching threat. Remember Diego Velázquez back in Cuba? Remember, he didn't like what Cortes did. He didn't like how Cortes usurped his authority. So Velázquez had sent a party of over 900 soldiers, with some sources saying it was actually 1,100 soldiers or conquistadors, led by a man named Panfilo de Narvaez. Narvaez's duty was to capture Cortes and bring him back to Cuba, where he would be tried for insubordination, mutiny, and treason, which probably would have led to them killing Cortes. Now, Narvaez and his men arrived in Mexico in April 1520. Upon hearing of his arrival, Cortes left between 140 and 200 men in Tenochtitlan under the leadership of one of his men, Pedro del Alvarado, and he journeyed to the coast with about 260 men. Now, Cortes, as you can see based on the maps we're presenting here, is clearly outnumbered. Now, Cortes decided to use a surprise attack by night to overcome Narvaez. Cortes and his men's quick movements, as well as their knowledge of the terrain, allowed such a venture to be successful. Now, in doing this, they captured Narvaez and convinced his soldiers to join them by telling the soldiers about Tenochtitlan. Cortes and his men and the new soldiers then began the tedious and lengthy trek back to Tenochtitlan. They were, however, upon their return, in for the shock of their lives. This is where we get to an event that is known as the massacre of the Great Temple of Tenochtitlan. Now, while Cortes was away, Pedro de Alvarado was placed as acting governor of Tenochtitlan. King Moctezuma asked Alvarado for permission to host a feast that was called Tlaxcala. Now, Tlaxcala was a feast that was dedicated to the Aztec god Tezcatlipoca. Now, the feast involved human sacrifice, and in this particular feast, they had to sacrifice a young man. Now, Alvarado interrupted the feast, and on May 22nd, 1520, he and his men began killing the warriors and noblemen who were in attendance. The reason for the massacre differs. The Spanish stated that it was because they wanted to prevent the human sacrifices. The Aztecs, however, stated that it was because of the Spanish being enticed by the immense amount of gold being won by the noblemen at the feast. However, in any case, it can be agreed that the massacre was unexpected and unprovoked. Those who escaped the massacre left the city and fled to other cities and towns to spread the news about the Spanish massacre. And then this massacre led into another event that is historically known as La Noche Triste, or the Night of Sorrows. So in retaliation to what the Spanish did, the Aztec warriors in Tenochtitlan rose up and besieged the compound that the Spanish held Moctezuma captive in. They also elected a new Tlatoani, a guy by the name of King Cuitlahuac. Therefore, when Cortes returned to Tenochtitlan, he met a city that was now back under Aztec rule fully with a new king and defeated conquistadors. Oh boy. Cortes ordered Moctezuma to go to a high terrace and speak to his people to encourage them to let the Spanish leave the city in peace. However, the people jeered Moctezuma and threw stones at him. Days later, Moctezuma died. Cortes and Alvarado decided that they should escape by night, and they even tried to inquire for a 1-week ceasefire. Now, for the ceasefire, the Spanish would restore gold that they took, although Cortes encouraged each soldier to take as much as he can. Now, Tenochtitlan was a city that was built on the waters of the then Lake Texcoco. So therefore, the Aztecs had to build these massive causeways to connect the city to the mainland. Now, there were about 8 causeways, 4 of which were destroyed by the Aztecs during the battle against the Spanish, because the Aztecs wanted to keep the Spanish hostage and prevent them from escaping. Now, the Spanish decided to escape on the seemingly unguarded Tlacopan Causeway. Now, while trying to escape by night, and under the cover of a rainstorm, they were spotted by a group of specialist Aztec warriors known as the Eagle Warriors. That's a cool name, the Eagle Warriors, as well as by a woman carrying water and an Aztec priest. Ooh, so an alarm was sounded and many Aztecs came out to fight against the Spanish to prevent them from escaping. And an epic battle was about to ensue. The Spanish had to fight for their lives while they were trying to cross this causeway. Aztec warriors, they even approached them by canoes, because remember we spoke about the Chinampas, so there were these waterways, so canoes were able to navigate around them. So Aztec warriors approached them by canoes to easily access the Spanish. Some Spanish soldiers fell into the lake and drowned. Some were hauled back into the city, and those that were hauled back into the city, they were used for human sacrifices. And some died immediately from wounds inflicted upon them during the conflict. Now, Cortes, Alvarado, and a few others escaped to the other side, although many of them were badly wounded, including both Cortes and Alvarado. The Spanish had even lost most of their artillery, their guns, their gunpowder, etc., as well as most of their horses. Now, although figures would vary, Cortes later reported that about 154 Spanish conquistadors and almost 2,000 native allies died that night. Now, upon seeing the loss of life they suffered, Cortes began crying, hence the name, the Night of Sorrows. And then this led into another event that was actually an event that was going to change the tide of this entire thing, the Battle of Otumba. Now, the Tlaxcaltec allies that the Spanish had helped to guide them around Lake Zumpango, which was a smaller lake that was joined to Lake Texcoco, in order to help the Spanish seek refuge in Tlaxcala. Now, while this happened, the Aztec warriors continued pursuing these fellas. And then on July 7, 1520, the Spanish and Tlaxcaltec natives met an army of Aztec warriors on the field of Tenochtitlan near the settlement of Otumba. Despite the Spanish being inferior in number, the use of cavalry and the tactical mistake by the Aztecs in attacking too late allowed the Spanish to overcome the Aztecs in that battle. So there was a shifting in the tide. Cortes' plan in the battle was to target the leaders in the army, specifically a captain named Matlanzincatl. The captain was slain along with other military leaders, and this allowed the Aztecs to be diminished and scattered. Cortes and his men eventually reached Tlaxcala, where they regrouped and planned to get revenge on the Aztecs and to besiege once and for all the city of Tenochtitlan. And this is where we look at the fall of Tenochtitlan. Now, both sides, the Aztecs and the Spanish, went on a quest of rebuilding alliances. The new Aztec emperor had to do everything he can to bring unity, as the empire was already prone to division. Remember, we spoke about the city-state situation. This setup allowed for the empire to be prone to that kind of level of division, especially with all the turmoil that was going on here. Cortes also went on a journey of re-establishing alliances with the Tlaxcaltecs and other surrounding settlements. Now, while Cortes was seeking to build his troops and strengthen his alliances, a smallpox epidemic broke out in the city of Tenochtitlan. It most likely would have been spread by a Spanish soldier who came with Narvaez and who was abandoned when Cortes fled the city. The epidemic lasted from October to December 1520, lasting for a period of about 60 days, and killed an estimated 1/3 of the inhabitants of not just Tenochtitlan, but of the entire Mexico Valley area. This resulted in not just immediate death from the disease, but it also resulted in starvation. And this was because many of the able-bodied persons in agriculture died, causing food supplies to deplete drastically. Now, with their increased force numbers, as well as the work of any cannons, armor, other weapons on horses that they had remaining, the Spanish were able to overcome the Aztecs. However, more than any other factor, the help of thousands of other indigenous people and the spread of the smallpox disease were the biggest contributors to the Spanish conquest. And by August 1521, Tenochtitlan was fallen. It is estimated that over 40,000 Aztecs, over 100 Spanish soldiers, and thousands of indigenous allies died during the siege of the city. So after Tenochtitlan, Cortes's entire campaign against Tenochtitlan, it cost the lives of over 240,000 Aztecs and almost 2,000 Spanish soldiers and thousands of indigenous allies. His conquest of Tenochtitlan and surrounding territories marked the beginning of European conquest in Mesoamerica. This became a major moment of shift as it marked the beginning of the Spanish paying more attention to conquest in Central and South America than in the governing of the Caribbean islands. Now, Cortes later named the conquered land New Spain of the Ocean Sea, which later became known as Mexico in honor of the Mexica people groups who lived in the Valley of Mexico before the fall of Tenochtitlan. Cortes then became governor, Captain General, and Chief Justice of this territory called New Spain. Cortes then engaged in an initiative known as the Spiritual Conquest of Mexico, where he made a request to the Spanish crown to send Franciscan and Dominican friars to convert the vast number of indigenous people in the land. He then led expeditions to Honduras, was given honorific titles, and his conquest of the Aztecs led to the creation by the Spanish crown of the Royal and Supreme Council of the Indies, an organ of the Spanish Empire that presided over the governance of the Americas and the Philippine Islands. And then on December 2nd, 1547, Hernan Cortes died in Seville, Spain. He had contracted dysentery and later on died from pleurisy. He was 62 years old. And this is where we come to the end of looking at Hernan Cortes and his interactions with and impact on the Aztec civilization. Now we're going to venture into an interesting event, an event that helped the Spanish to accomplish something they wanted to accomplish from the very start: to sail to the east, to sail to India, to reach the Indies by sailing west. Were they ever going to accomplish it? Well, now they will. Let's look in our next episode at the Magellan expedition. But this has been another episode of Island Uplift History class. I hope to see you in the next one. But for now, Class dismissed.